All this week I've been reflecting on the covenant God made with Abraham, with an emphasis on God's ultimate purpose in that covenant, namely, to bring blessing through Abraham to all the families of the earth. This covenant is fundamental to our identity as Christians and to our high calling. Our highest concern, you see, is not for ourselves or even for our own salvation, but for the glorification of God and following where God leads us. And it is clear that God is concerned not only for his chosen people, but indeed for all the world. And the means God has chosen to bless the world is through us. It is a very high calling. So, how do we go about fulfilling this high calling? That's our concern for today. Hello, I'm Stuart Baskin, pastor of First Presbyterian Church of Tyler, Texas, and this is your daily devotional for Friday, March 3rd, 2023. Christian faith contains a variety of paradoxes. When we try to resolve the paradoxes on one side or the other, that's when we get into trouble. For example, if I pose the question, are we saved only by the grace of God, or are we responsible for our faith? The proper answer would be yes, not an either or, but a both and. In faith, we respond to the grace of God. People who insist on perfect logical consistency all the time find the paradoxical nature of Christian faith frustrating at best and a stumbling block at worst. Then they either reject one side or the other of the theological paradox or reject Christian faith altogether. I know this sounds like a bit of a tangent, but hear me out. When we receive our marching orders to be a blessing to the world, some think it gives them a license to harangue the unchurched, pushing them relentlessly to believe in Jesus. What happens is usually the opposite. People can be so repulsed by this well-meaning badgering that they reject faith in Jesus Christ altogether. But what if blessing the world doesn't mean we are responsible for making unbelievers into believers? What if, instead of haranguing and badgering, our job were simpler than that? In a passage in his letter to the Romans, Paul makes an important observation about Abraham. It's not exactly on point here, but it suggests something important for our calling. Paul says, "What then are we to say was gained by Abraham, our ancestor, according to the flesh? For if Abraham was justified by works, he has something to boast about, but not before God. For what does the Scripture say? Abraham believed God, and it was reckoned to him as righteousness. Now, to one who works, wages are not reckoned as a gift, but as something due. But to one who without works trusts him who justifies the ungodly, such faith is reckoned as righteousness." As I say, this passage is not exactly about Abraham's mission to be a blessing. It is about his trust in God's promises. It wasn't so much that God blessed Abraham for what he did, but for the fact that he believed God. We know that Abraham had a lot of false starts along the way. Twice, for example, he held out his wife Sarah as his sister in order to save himself from being murdered. And he had a child with Sarah's maid, Hagar, believing that he had to take matters into his own hands to have a child. But in spite of these missteps, God did not reject Abraham, for Abraham still fundamentally believed God. So what does this have to do with our vocation to bless the world? Everything. It turns out we are not responsible for making non-believers into believers. We are responsible for bearing witness. In part, bearing witness has to do with what we say regarding our beliefs and, even more importantly, about our experience of God's grace in our lives. But bearing witness also means acting in ways that reflect the grace of God. There are churches that place such an emphasis on making conversions that everything comes down to the question, how many people have you saved? The only true answer to that question is 0. I, for example, have never saved a single soul, and neither have you. God saves souls. We act simply as ambassadors, sharing our experience of God's grace. Salvation does not happen because we make it happen. Salvation happens when our words and our lives reflect the kind of loving mercy God has shown to us. Salvation happens when God uses our gentle spirits to demonstrate to others the kind of God that He really is. Salvation happens when we bear witness and then get out of the way of God's Spirit at work. It really is that simple. Tomorrow, what has God done for us, and how might that translate into being a blessing to the world? But for now, may God continue to bless you and keep you in all that you do this day and in all the days ahead.